This is a chilling story. A successful black woman surgeon is in the middle of an operation on her young sister when police suddenly burst in, accusing her of robbery. Her pleas to save her sister are ignored, and an unimaginable nightmare unfolds. Make sure to watch until the end to see the consequences of their actions. Subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts on this story in the comments. Dr. Alana Turner took a deep, calming breath, standing just outside the operating room door. She knew that today's surgery was no ordinary procedure. It was a lifeline, one she held in her hands for the person she cherished more than anyone else in the world, her little sister, Olivia. Alana's life as a highly skilled, dedicated surgeon was built upon the idea of saving lives, but today the stakes felt far higher and more personal than ever before. Today, it was Olivia's life she held in her hands. Inside the operating room, Olivia lay on the table, small and vulnerable, her young face framed by the edge of the surgical drape. At only 11 years old, she had already gone through so much for someone so young. Her illness had been a storm that swept through their lives, threatening to uproot everything. But Alana's skills and determination had kept Olivia afloat, and today's operation was the final step to ensure her recovery. Alana had spent weeks preparing for this surgery, every step meticulously planned to give her sister the best possible chance of survival. Alana's heart ached, watching Olivia's small frame rise and fall with each careful breath. She remembered the countless nights spent comforting her sister, offering words of encouragement while holding back her own fears. Now, as she prepared to step into the operating room, she felt a deep sense of hope mixed with a pang of anxiety that she hadn't been able to shake. Her role as Olivia's surgeon was clear, but the role of an older sister still loomed over her, both grounding her and making the weight of the moment feel that much heavier. As she suited up, Olivia's weak voice pulled her attention. "Alana, will it hurt?" Alana bent over, her gloved hand gently squeezing Olivia's small one, the surgical gloves between them not enough to muffle the warmth she wanted to convey. "No, honey, you won't feel a thing. I'll be right here the whole time, making sure everything goes perfectly. Before you know it, you'll be back to being your silly self, and we'll go get that ice cream we talked about." Olivia managed a small, tired smile, though Alana could see the worry in her eyes. "Promise?" "I promise," Alana said softly, holding back her own emotions, determined not to show any fear. "Now, I want you to close your eyes, think of something happy, and let me do my magic. You'll be okay, Liv. I've got you." The last few words lingered in the air, both a comfort to Olivia and a reassurance to herself. As Olivia's eyes fluttered shut, Alana steadied her breathing, ready to start the surgery that would hopefully give her sister a new lease on life. The surgical team moved around her with practiced efficiency, each member acutely aware of the importance of this operation. They had all prepared thoroughly, knowing this was not just another patient on the table, but someone deeply personal to their chief surgeon. There was a unique tension in the air, a mutual understanding that went beyond medical professionalism. Alana gave her team one final nod, signaling her readiness, and they began. As the surgery progressed, Alana's focus became a razor's edge, each movement deliberate, each decision calculated. She felt the pressure to perform perfectly, not only as Olivia's sister, but as a doctor who knew that mistakes in this moment were simply not an option. The medical equipment hummed softly around them, and Alana kept her breathing steady, her hands precise, drawing on every ounce of her training and experience. Hours slipped by in silence, interrupted only by the occasional exchange of words between Alana and her team. The surgery was going well. She could feel it. They were nearing the final stages, and she was starting to feel a glimmer of relief. Soon, Olivia would be out of danger, and they could look forward to the life that lay ahead, free from this persistent shadow. But just as she was about to finish the last step, a loud noise broke the sterile calm of the operating room. The doors burst open with a force that startled everyone. Alana looked up, her mind briefly blank with surprise. In the doorway stood 3 police officers, their expressions hard, their postures rigid and intimidating. "What's going on here?" Alana's voice, usually so steady, wavered with confusion. One of the officers, a tall man with a severe look, stepped forward. "We're looking for a suspect in a robbery that happened nearby. A pharmacy just down the street. She matches the description, and we need her to come with us right now." Alana blinked, trying to process what he was saying. "I'm in the middle of surgery. This is my patient, my sister, and we're at a critical stage. I can't leave." The officer's expression didn't soften. "Ma'am, we're not asking. You fit the description of the suspect. You're under suspicion of committing a felony, and we're going to have to ask you to come with us." A ripple of shock passed through Alana. "I'm a surgeon. I'm in the middle of an operation. This is absurd. I can't just abandon my patient. She'll die if I don't finish this." But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The officer gave her a stern look, impatience evident in his stance. "Ma'am, we don't know anything about that. All we know is that there was a robbery, and you fit the description. Either you cooperate, or we'll have to take action." Alana felt her pulse quicken. The thought of leaving Olivia at such a critical moment, of abandoning her sister who relied on her, was unthinkable. She swallowed hard, choosing her words carefully. "Please, I beg you, just give me a few more minutes to finish this. My sister's life depends on it." The officer's gaze hardened. "You're refusing to cooperate. That's resisting arrest." Before Alana could protest further, he nodded to his fellow officers who stepped forward, ready to forcibly remove her. Panic surged through her as she struggled, her voice rising in desperation. "Please, I'm begging you. My sister's on this table and her life is in my hands. I'm the only one who can finish this surgery. If I don't, she could die." But they showed no mercy. The officer nearest her grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the operating table. Alana fought, her heart racing, her mind screaming at the injustice, the absurdity of what was happening. She twisted in their grasp, her eyes locking onto Olivia's still, fragile form on the table. "Olivia!" she called out, as if her sister could hear her, as if somehow her voice could hold her safe. In that moment, the officer holding her tightened his grip, twisting her arm painfully. The other officer, exasperated, took a step closer to Olivia, his face twisted in irritation. "Enough. You and your little accomplice aren't fooling anyone. If she's in on this, maybe a little discipline will set her straight." And then, with a swift, brutal motion, he raised his baton and struck Olivia. The sound reverberated through the room, echoing off the sterile walls, piercing Alana's heart. She gasped, her strength faltering as a mix of horror and helplessness washed over her. She struggled harder, but the officer held her firm, his expression unyielding. "Stop! Please, stop!" Alana screamed, her voice raw with desperation. She pleaded, reaching out toward Olivia, as if she could somehow bridge the distance between them, as if her voice alone could shield her sister from the cruelty of the world that had barged in, uninvited and unforgiving. But her cries fell on deaf ears. The officer's baton struck down again, and then again. each blow searing itself into Alana's memory, each one a brutal reminder of her powerlessness. She was yanked backward, pulled away from the operating table, her eyes locked on Olivia's small, lifeless form, now left abandoned, vulnerable, and bleeding. Her pleas turned to sobs as she was dragged out of the operating room, her voice echoing down the hall as if it could somehow reach her sister, as if there was any chance that someone would listen. But no one did. The sterile, quiet world of the operating room had erupted into chaos. Dr. Alana Turner, one of the hospital's most accomplished surgeons, now found herself trapped, restrained by 2 police officers, dragged away from the critical operation on her younger sister, Olivia. The world she had spent years building, a world of skill, compassion, and unwavering responsibility, seemed to collapse around her in an instant. Olivia, her 11-year-old sister, lay unconscious on the operating table, her small body hooked up to machines that beeped steadily, each sound a reminder of the life she was fighting to protect. Every second counted, and Alana knew that abandoning the surgery now would put Olivia's life at severe risk. Yet here she was, physically restrained, her cries for mercy ignored. As she struggled against the officers, Alana's pleas became more desperate. "You don't understand. She's my sister. If I don't finish this surgery, she could die." One of the officers, Officer Barnes, a tall, stern man with a seemingly unshakable demeanor, tightened his grip on her arm. His voice was cold, dismissive, as if her words held no weight at all. "We told you, ma'am. There was a robbery nearby. We're here because you match the description of the suspect. We've already told you. Stop resisting." "Resisting? You're stopping me from saving her." Alana's voice was hoarse with desperation, and yet the officers looked on, unmoved. "If you would just let me explain. Please, she's just a little girl. She's innocent." The officers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of impatience and thinly veiled contempt. Officer Jenkins, a shorter man with a hardened look, narrowed his eyes at Alana, clearly irritated. "We're not here to negotiate with you. We're here to enforce the law. If your sister is involved, then she's just as much a suspect as you are." The words cut through her like ice, the sheer cruelty of the implication sinking deep. They were accusing Olivia, her sweet, innocent little sister, barely old enough to understand what was happening, of being her accomplice. Alana's mind reeled, the absurdity and injustice of the situation hitting her like a physical blow. In a final, desperate attempt, she tried once more, her voice breaking as she pleaded with the officers. "Please, if there's even a shred of humanity in you, let me finish. I'll come with you willingly afterward. Just let me finish the surgery." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. Jenkins sneered, his eyes filled with disdain. "A likely story. This whole setup, your little medical charade, it's a cover, isn't it? You think you're going to fool us?" Alana's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to comprehend the depth of their misjudgment. She knew there was no point in arguing, yet she couldn't stop herself. The need to protect Olivia overwhelmed her, driving her to defy the officers even as they restrained her. "This isn't a charade. This is my life's work, and that's my sister on the table. I am a surgeon, and if you don't let me finish, she could—" But she was cut off by Jenkins, who yanked her back roughly. In the corner of her eye, she could see Barnes advancing towards Olivia, a dark look clouding his face. Her heart plummeted as she realized what he intended to do. "Don't you dare touch her!" Alana screamed, trying to wrench herself free from Jenkins' grip, her voice filled with a terror she had never known before. "She's just a child." Barnes ignored her, his jaw set with grim determination. He walked up to Olivia, his expression twisting with irritation and impatience. In a chilling voice, he muttered, "If she's your accomplice, then maybe a little discipline will make her cooperate." And then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he raised his baton and brought it down with a brutal force against Olivia's small, unconscious form. The sound of the impact echoed through the room, a sickening thud that seemed to reverberate in Alana's ears, magnified by her helplessness. Her vision blurred, her thoughts spiraling into panic and horror. "No!" she screamed, her voice breaking with despair. "Stop! Please, she's just a little girl. Please stop!" Barnes struck Olivia again, each blow a horrifying testament to his indifference. Alana's voice rose to a fever pitch, her screams filling the room as she begged them to show mercy. But mercy was a foreign concept to the officers, their faces blank slates devoid of empathy. Alana's knees buckled as she watched, powerless, every ounce of her being focused on reaching Olivia, even as Jenkins held her back, restraining her with an unyielding grip. She clawed at his arms, her desperation driving her beyond reason, but he held her firmly, his grip like iron. "Olivia!" she cried, her voice cracking, raw with pain and horror. "Olivia, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." But her words were swallowed up by the sterile, unfeeling walls of the operating room. The team that had once surrounded her, dedicated and focused, had been pushed aside, their own fear and confusion paralyzing them, leaving Alana and Olivia to the cruelty of the intruders. Finally, as if satisfied, Barnes stepped back, his face cold and impassive as he regarded Alana. She could see her sister's small body, now motionless, the life she had fought so hard to protect hanging by a fragile thread. Jenkins jerked her back once more, his voice a low growl. "Enough of this show. You're coming with us now, like it or not." A strangled cry escaped her lips as she felt herself being dragged towards the door. Every fiber of her being screamed in protest, her mind reeling with the realization that she was being pulled away from the one person she had promised to protect. Her vision blurred with tears, her cries echoing in the cold, indifferent room as she was forced away from Olivia. "Please, please, just let me finish." Her voice was a whisper now, broken and filled with despair. "Please, let me save her." But her words were swallowed by the harsh fluorescent lights and sterile walls, leaving only a hollow silence in their wake. As the officers dragged Dr. Alana Turner out of the operating room, her mind screamed with desperation, helplessly looping over the last image she had of Olivia, her young, fragile body lying abandoned on the operating table, bruised and beaten, with life slipping away from her with each passing second. The surgical team, who had been equally paralyzed by shock, now hovered in horror, but they knew better than to intervene with armed police officers. Every step Alana took away from her sister felt like a mile stretching further from hope. She twisted, struggling against the unyielding hands of the officers, her voice hoarse with despair. "Please, I'm begging you," she cried, choking back tears. "Just let me go back. My sister needs me." But her pleas, as they had been from the beginning, were ignored. Jenkins, still clutching her arm tightly, exchanged an irritated glance with Barnes, who walked beside them with a look of cold satisfaction on his face. "Enough with the theatrics," Jenkins growled, tightening his grip. "It's always the same story. Thinks she can play victim to get away with it." Alana's desperation flared into anger. "Get away with what? I'm a surgeon, trying to save my sister's life," she shouted, her voice edged with fury. "Can't you see? She's a child. She was just a patient in need of surgery." Barnes snorted, clearly unmoved. "Don't even start," he said with disdain. "We know your type. Thinks the world will let her do whatever she wants because she has a fancy job. Her fists clenched in frustration. I'm not trying to do whatever I want. I'm trying to save my sister. Alana's voice cracked under the weight of her emotions, her heart pounding with a dread that grew with every step they took away from the operating room. She knew the critical condition Olivia was in, and she knew that without her, Olivia's chances were slim. But Barnes turned to her with a mocking sneer. "Oh, and we're supposed to just believe you? I think we've seen enough professional types in our day." Alana's patience finally snapped. "You're all fools," she yelled, wrenching against their grip. "You're going to let an innocent child die because of your prejudice." The words were barely out of her mouth when she felt a brutal shove, sending her sprawling to the ground. The cold, hard tile of the hospital floor bit into her hands and knees as she struggled to push herself up, only for Barnes to plant a heavy boot on her back, pinning her in place. "Keep that up," he warned, his voice filled with a venomous edge, "and you'll find yourself in even more trouble than you're already in." Through the fog of pain and fear, Alana could only think of Olivia, lying alone, without help, without hope. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, a feeling of pure helplessness seeping into every fiber of her being. All the years she had spent studying, training, sacrificing to become a surgeon, to save lives, and in this single moment, it was all being ripped away from her, rendered meaningless by the brutal hands of the very people meant to protect. She lay there, trembling with frustration and grief, her voice barely a whisper as she gasped, "Please, she's just a little girl." But Barnes only chuckled, a chilling sound that sent a shiver down her spine. That little girl was probably in on it too. Don't you know it's always the innocent-looking ones who turn out to be the worst? Alana's mind reeled at the absurdity, the cruelty of his words. Olivia was a child, innocent and vulnerable, and here they were, these officers who had stormed into her life with their own twisted views and decided, without a shred of evidence, that she was guilty. Without warning, Jenkins yanked her up by her arm, forcing her to her feet as she stumbled, barely able to stand. "You're done here," he said coldly, his gaze devoid of any empathy, as if he were staring at a criminal and not a woman who had dedicated her life to saving others. Alana's heart ached with every step they forced her to take, every inch that separated her from Olivia. The surgical team and hospital staff looked on, some with horror, others with sorrow, yet none dared to intervene. She could see the looks in their eyes, the silent apologies they couldn't bring themselves to voice. Their helplessness mirrored her own, trapped in the confines of an unfeeling system. As they neared the hospital exit, Alana made one last, desperate plea. "If there's anything human left in you, I'm begging you, just let me go back for her. She's only 11. I'm the only one who can save her." But Jenkins only tightened his grip, his face a mask of irritation. "Enough. We've heard enough of your lies. Let the courts deal with you, doctor," he said, the last words spat out with venom, as if it were a taunt, a mockery of all she had worked for. The finality of his words sank deep into Alana's chest, and for the first time she felt the cold, sharp edge of despair settle into her bones. There would be no help, no miracle. The very people she had trusted to protect and serve had become her captors, and no amount of begging or reasoning would sway them. They pushed her into the back of a police car, slamming the door shut as if sealing her fate. As the car pulled away from the hospital, Alana's gaze locked onto the building, her eyes fixed on the operating room window, knowing that her sister was lying there, alone and fading. She had promised Olivia she would be there, that she would make everything better. But now that promise lay broken, and her world shattered alongside it. The ride to the station was filled with silence, punctuated only by the cold, accusing gazes of her captors. Alana's mind raced, replaying the last moments she'd had with Olivia, her small voice filled with trust, asking her big sister to protect her. But she had failed her in the worst possible way, and the weight of that failure pressed down on her like a crushing force. In the back of the car, Alana allowed herself to finally break, silent tears slipping down her cheeks as the reality set in. She knew the cruelty of the world, had faced hardships before, but nothing could have prepared her for this brutal, senseless cruelty that had taken everything she held dear. And then, just as the despair threatened to consume her completely, a sudden surge of rage bubbled up within her, fierce and unyielding. The system that had betrayed her, that had taken her sister, that had cast her aside based on nothing but their own prejudice, it would not break her. She would find justice for Olivia, for the innocent life that had been lost, and she would make sure that the world knew her sister's name, her story. As they pulled up to the station, Alana steeled herself, her mind settling into a grim determination. They might have taken her freedom, her career, her sister, but they had not taken her will to fight. The police could have her in chains, but they would never own her spirit. And as she was led into the station, the light of the early morning casting long shadows across the gray, unfeeling walls, Alana made a silent vow. For Olivia, for herself, and for every innocent life that had been trampled by the same injustice, she would make sure the world saw the truth, no matter the cost. The station was a cold, sterile place, its walls a dull, unforgiving gray that seemed to reflect the indifference of the officers who moved through it. Dr. Alana Turner sat alone in an interrogation room, her wrists cuffed to the table, a thin trickle of blood marking where the metal had cut into her skin during her struggle. Hours had passed since they had dragged her from her sister's side, hours in which she had sat alone, gripped by a cold terror for what might have happened to Olivia. No one had given her any information. No one had listened to her pleas. She had been processed, fingerprinted, treated like a criminal without a single shred of proof. Now she waited, trapped in a fog of worry and anger, her mind circling back endlessly to Olivia's small, fragile form on the operating table, alone and unprotected. The door finally creaked open, and a detective stepped inside carrying a thick folder. He had a tired look, as if he had spent years seeing the worst of humanity and had come to expect it in everyone he met. His gaze settled on Alana, cold and calculating, as if he were appraising a case rather than seeing a human being. "Dr. Turner," he said, his voice devoid of sympathy, "I'm Detective Hayes. We have some questions for you." Alana's voice was hoarse, her throat raw from hours of silence. "My sister, please, tell me if she's all right." Hayes looked at her, a flicker of something inscrutable passing over his face before it hardened again. "Let's focus on why you're here," he said, ignoring her question. "You're under investigation for your involvement in a robbery at a pharmacy. A witness identified someone matching your description." The absurdity of the accusation felt like a slap even now. She met his gaze, her eyes blazing. "I was in surgery. I'm a surgeon, detective, and I was operating on my sister when your officers stormed in and pulled me away. You can check the hospital records, speak to my team. I had nothing to do with any robbery." He seemed unimpressed, flipping through his folder without looking up. "These records take time to verify, Dr. Turner. Meanwhile, we're investigating all possibilities." Alana clenched her fist, her patience wearing thin. All possibilities? I am the head surgeon at that hospital, and I was doing my job. I'm not a criminal, and neither is my sister. She's 11 years old, for God's sake. Detective Hayes leaned back, his expression impassive. And yet, here you are. Your description matches what we have from the scene, and until we can confirm otherwise, we have to consider you a suspect. A wave of helpless anger washed over her. Did you even try to verify where I was? Did you even check with the hospital? He raised an eyebrow, unfazed. We'll confirm everything in due time. Now, do you have anything to say about the events at the pharmacy? Alana's face contorted with frustration. I have nothing to do with any robbery. I was with my sister trying to save her life while your officers interrupted her surgery and... Her voice trailed off, the image of Barnes raising his baton over Olivia flashing in her mind, sharp and painful. Hayes's gaze flicked up, catching her hesitation. And? He prompted. A dark cloud settled over her expression, her voice barely above a whisper. And they hit her, repeatedly. She was just a child, lying on that operating table, defenseless, and they struck her. Her voice trembled, raw with fury and sorrow. She was dying, and they didn't care. For the first time, something shifted in Hayes's expression. He glanced at the file, then back at her, his eyes narrowing. That's a serious accusation. It's not an accusation, it's a fact, Alana snapped. There were cameras in that room. You have the footage. You have everything you need to see the truth. He was silent for a moment, then stood up, closing the file. I'll look into it. As he left the room, Alana felt her emotions crash down on her like a tidal wave. She gripped the edge of the table, her heart pounding, her body trembling with a mixture of fear, anger, and profound sorrow. If the footage existed, and she knew it did, then maybe, just maybe, there was hope for justice. But that hope was tinged with an all-consuming dread. Olivia had been left on that table, helpless and injured, and no amount of evidence would change the fact that she hadn't been there to protect her. Hours passed in the cold, empty room. She was left alone with her thoughts, her memories of Olivia's laughter, her small hand gripping hers before the surgery. The image of her sister's eyes closing in trust, believing that her big sister, her protector, would keep her safe. Now, all Alana had was the silence, thick and suffocating, a void where her sister's life had once been. Finally, the door opened again, but this time it was not Detective Hayes who entered. It was a younger officer, looking uncomfortable as he stood before her, a guarded expression on his face. Dr. Turner, he said quietly, his tone softer than those she had encountered so far. We've received some updates. Alana looked up, her heart racing with both hope and dread. What? What updates? The officer hesitated, as if the words he carried were too heavy to deliver. There was an incident in the operating room. I'm afraid your sister, she didn't make it. The words slammed into her like a physical blow, her breath leaving her in a painful rush. For a moment, the world tilted, her vision blurring as the weight of his words crushed her. She felt her hands go numb, the cold metal of the handcuffs digging into her wrists, grounding her in a reality she wished desperately to escape. No, she whispered, her voice breaking. No, you're lying. She was supposed to be okay. I was supposed to save her. The officer looked away, unable to meet her gaze. I'm sorry, he murmured, his voice barely audible. The footage shows what happened. It's gone viral. People are outraged. Alana barely registered his words. Viral. People outraged. It all felt distant, meaningless against the crushing grief that filled every corner of her being. Her sister, her sweet, innocent Olivia, was gone. And she hadn't been there, hadn't been able to hold her hand, hadn't been able to protect her when she needed it most. Her body shook with silent sobs, the pain too deep for words, too vast to be contained. She could hear the officer speaking, his voice drifting in and out of her awareness. "There's an investigation now," he was saying, almost as if to himself. "The public is demanding accountability. They want justice for your sister. For you. Justice." The word felt hollow, empty, a cruel mockery in the face of her loss. Nothing would bring Olivia back. Nothing would undo the horror of those final moments, the betrayal, the brutality, the absolute failure of the system that was supposed to protect them. The officer continued, his voice wavering slightly. "The officers involved have been detained. There will be consequences." Alana closed her eyes, the ache in her chest deepening with each passing second. Consequences. What did it matter now? No punishment could ever make up for what she had lost, what Olivia had lost, the life they had stolen from her, the dreams they had shattered, her sister's bright future, her laughter, her kindness. All of it was gone, snuffed out by a senseless act of cruelty. In the silence that followed, the officer hesitated, then quietly left the room, leaving her alone once more. Alana sat in the cold, empty room, her mind replaying every moment of that horrible day, every desperate plea, every helpless cry. She had fought with everything she had, but it hadn't been enough. And now she was left with nothing but the memory of her sister, a precious light extinguished far too soon. As she sat there, surrounded by the sterile walls, the weight of her grief settled into her bones, a silent promise forming within her. They would remember Olivia. The world would know her name, her story. They would see the truth of what had been done, and no matter how hollow it felt, she would demand justice. Not just for Olivia, but for every innocent life cut short by prejudice, by ignorance, by hatred. And as she waited, alone in that room, Alana made a vow, her heart hardened by loss, her spirit fueled by a determination that would not be silenced. They would remember Olivia, and they would never forget the price she had paid. The days that followed felt like a fevered dream to Alana, drifting between painful reality and a numbness so deep it seemed to engulf her soul. News of Olivia's death had spread far and wide, the video footage capturing every brutal moment in the operating room circulating across the country. The hospital's security footage had revealed everything, from the moment the officers entered the operating room to the savage strikes that ultimately ended Olivia's life. The country was gripped with outrage, each viewer bearing witness to the heart-wrenching tragedy that had taken Alana's sister. But, despite the national outcry, Alana felt hollow, the world around her reduced to shades of gray as grief hollowed out every part of her. At first, she barely registered the surge of support pouring in from strangers, advocates, and even public officials. Messages of solidarity filled the hospital's inbox, and letters arrived from people she had never met. They all expressed sympathy, but each word felt like a hollow echo to her. She couldn't bring herself to read them fully, her mind too fixated on the aching emptiness left by Olivia's absence. It was as if every kind word, every offering of support, only deepened the pit inside her. Nothing could reach her. Nothing could bridge the chasm that had opened in her heart. At times, she could hear the distant hum of news reports, people calling for justice, prominent figures demanding accountability. She saw the faces of the officers involved, now held in custody, shown in news clips as their actions were dissected by anchors and experts alike. But even the news of their arrest brought her no solace. Nothing mattered. Not the condemnations, not the promises of change. The system's reckoning felt like a hollow, meaningless gesture, coming far too late. The day of Olivia's funeral arrived, and Alana found herself staring blankly at the mirror, struggling to recognize her own reflection. The woman who stared back at her looked like a shell, eyes shadowed with grief, face hollowed by sleepless nights and silent tears. It was as if she had aged years in mere days, her spirit fractured beyond repair. She had spent the days in a haze, each moment blending into the next, each memory of Olivia haunting her thoughts with the painful weight of unfulfilled promises and shattered dreams. A gentle knock at the door startled her, pulling her from her trance. It was a friend, one of her colleagues from the hospital, come to escort her to the service. She looked up, trying to summon the strength to face the day, to honor Olivia's memory, but her body felt weak, as if the weight of her grief was pressing down on her, robbing her of any remaining strength. The service was held in a small sunlit chapel filled to the brim with people. Family, friends, colleagues, strangers moved by Olivia's story. Rows upon rows of faces watched Alana as she entered, each gaze filled with sympathy, sorrow, and a shared sense of injustice. A wave of murmured condolences met her, voices offering words of comfort that only grazed the edges of her awareness. She moved forward, her steps slow and unsteady, every movement weighed down by the knowledge of what she had lost. At the front of the room, a small white casket lay surrounded by flowers, delicate lilies and roses that filled the air with their scent, a poignant contrast to the dark reality they signified. Alana's breath caught in her throat as she approached, her vision blurring as the sight of the casket brought the full force of her loss crashing down on her. Her little sister, her bright, hopeful Olivia, lay within that casket, the life that had filled their world now gone, leaving behind only memories and an unbearable ache. Alana's hand trembled as she reached out, brushing her fingers over the smooth, cold surface, her heart clenching painfully as she struggled to hold herself together. Her lips moved in a silent apology, a final promise that she would keep Olivia's memory alive, that she would not let the world forget what had happened. A eulogy was read, each word a tribute to Olivia's kindness, her innocence, her dreams for the future that had been stolen in an instant. People spoke of her laughter, her joy, the light she had brought into their lives, but every word felt like a knife to Alana's heart, a painful reminder of what had been taken, what could never be replaced. As the service continued, she felt her chest tighten, a pressure building within her that she could no longer contain. Her heart ached with a pain so profound it felt as if it would tear her apart. She wanted to scream, to cry out against the injustice, the cruelty that had taken her sister, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stood in silence, her shoulders hunched under the weight of her grief, her gaze fixed on the casket, unable to look away. In the midst of her sorrow, a wave of dizziness washed over her, and she swayed, clutching at the edge of a nearby pew for support. Her heart was racing, each beat a painful reminder of the life within her, a life that felt hollow and meaningless without Olivia. The room began to blur, the voices around her fading as her vision darkened, her body weakened by the unrelenting agony that filled her chest. Someone was calling her name, their voice distant and muffled, but she couldn't respond. She felt herself sinking, her legs giving out as the world tilted, the edges of her vision going dark. The last thing she saw was the image of Olivia's casket, the final resting place of the sister she had loved with every fiber of her being. And then everything went black. When she awoke, she found herself lying on a small cot in a back room of the chapel, the concerned faces of friends and family hovering over her. They spoke in soft tones, their voices gentle, but the words barely registered. All she could think of was Olivia, her mind circling back to that final image of the casket, the flowers, the life they had lost. Her heart, already worn and battered, felt as if it might stop entirely, unable to bear the weight of her grief. She could feel it faltering, each beat a struggle, her chest aching with a pain that was both physical and emotional. It was as if her very soul were giving way, the life within her slowly slipping away under the crushing burden of loss. They urged her to rest, to take time to heal, but the words held no meaning. Her life, once filled with purpose and promise, now felt empty, a hollow shell left behind by the tragedy that had taken Olivia. And as the days passed, the pain in her chest grew, each beat a painful reminder of what she had lost, of the promises she had been unable to keep. One night, as she lay in bed, staring into the darkness, she felt the final surge of pain in her heart, a sharp, searing ache that brought tears to her eyes. She clutched at her chest, her breath shallow, her body trembling as the pain deepened, spreading through her like a wave. And in that moment, as her heart gave out, she felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet release that carried her away from the pain, the grief, the unbearable weight of her loss. Alana's life slipped away in the quiet of the night, her heart finally broken by the tragedy that had taken Olivia. And when her friends found her the next morning, they mourned the loss of a woman who had given everything for her family, a sister who had loved fiercely, who had fought until her last breath. At the funeral, the chapel was filled once more, a somber gathering of those who had known and loved Alana and Olivia, now united in grief. Flowers adorned the room, and a soft melody played, a final tribute to the lives that had been cut short by the cruel hand of prejudice and injustice. And as the service came to a close, a hush fell over the crowd, a silent promise shared among them. They would not forget. The world had been forever changed by the loss of two innocent lives, a tragedy that would resonate for years to come. The morning was gray, a light drizzle casting a somber veil over the city as people gathered to pay their final respects. Word of Alana and Olivia's tragic story had spread like wildfire, sparking a nationwide movement for justice and accountability. Alana's fight, her unyielding dedication to her sister, and the cruelty that ended both their lives, had struck a deep chord within countless hearts, and today the world had come to mourn, to remember, and to demand change. Hundreds of people filled the cemetery, an immense crowd united by grief and outrage. The air was thick with a mixture of sorrow and determination, voices murmuring softly, exchanging stories of the lives Alana and Olivia had touched. Alana's friends, her colleagues, former patients, strangers who had been moved by her story, all had come to bear witness. The funeral was a stark reminder of the injustice they had suffered, and every face in the crowd reflected the weight of the loss. The caskets of Alana and Olivia lay side by side, covered in lilies, roses, and messages from those who had known them. Each flower, each handwritten note, was a testament to the love and respect the sisters had earned. The soft music of a violin played in the background, a melody filled with heartache, echoing the pain shared by every person in attendance. Family members stood close, tears glistening on their faces as they gazed at the caskets, their eyes filled with the deep, wrenching sorrow that only comes from an irreparable loss. In the front row, Alana's closest friends and fellow surgeons sat together, their faces solemn. They had known Alana as more than a colleague. She had been their friend, their mentor, their inspiration. They remembered her as a fierce protector, someone who had fought tirelessly for her patients, her family, and the principles she held dear. Olivia, the bright young girl they had watched grow up through Alana's stories, had been a light in her sister's life, a source of hope and joy. Their loss felt like a wound that would never fully heal. The silence was broken as one of Alana's friends, Dr. Sarah Mendez, stepped forward to deliver the eulogy. Her hands shook slightly as she held her notes, her voice cracking as she began to speak. Alana was more than a doctor. She was a healer, a mentor, a sister. She was someone who gave everything for the people she loved, who never hesitated to stand up for what was right. She saved lives every day, but it was Olivia who brought her the greatest joy. Sarah paused, her gaze drifting to Olivia's casket, the small white box draped with flowers. Olivia was only 11, but her spirit was bright. She loved to dance, to sing, to make others laugh. She was the heart of Alana's life and the light that kept her going through every hardship. Their bond was unbreakable, and it's that bond we remember today. They were taken from us by an unimaginable cruelty, but their memory will never fade. A tear slipped down Sarah's cheek as she continued. Alana and Olivia taught us what it means to love fiercely, to stand strong, and to fight for each other. And today, as we lay them to rest, we carry their memory with us as a reminder of the work we must continue, the justice we must seek, for them and for everyone who has been wronged. As she finished, Sarah stepped back, her head bowed and a wave of grief washed over the crowd, soft sobs and sniffles filling the air. People reached for each other, holding hands, offering comfort as they stood united in sorrow. The violin music resumed, its mournful notes weaving through the crowd, a final farewell to the lives that had been cut so tragically short. In the days that followed, the public's demand for justice grew louder, calls for police reform and accountability echoing across the nation. The footage of the brutal attack on Olivia and Alana had gone viral, a harrowing testament to the senselessness of their deaths. The officers involved were tried and convicted, sentenced to life in prison, their actions condemned as a betrayal of the very principles they had sworn to uphold. But for those who had known and loved Alana and Olivia, justice felt bittersweet. No verdict, no sentence could bring back the lives they had lost, the laughter, the love, the dreams that had been stolen in an instant. Yet their legacy remained, a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit, the strength of love, and the need for change. The impact of Alana and Olivia's story sparked a wave of reforms. The police department implemented mandatory training on bias and accountability. Community leaders called for greater oversight, and across the country, people marched in memory of the sisters, their voices rising in unison, demanding a better, fairer world. As the years passed, Alana and Olivia's memory lived on in the hearts of those who had been touched by their story. Hospitals, schools, and community centers dedicated in their honor bore their names, each one a tribute to their courage, their love, and their unbreakable bond. And every time someone stepped through the doors of those institutions, they were reminded of the sisters who had inspired a movement, who had shown the world that even in the face of tragedy, there is always hope for change. This tragic story must not be forgotten. The actions of these people changed lives and touched the hearts of thousands worldwide. Let's make sure injustices like these don't happen again. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and leave a comment. Your thoughts matter. Let's stand together for justice.